The trunk had been sealed for 180 years, its iron clasps crumbling into flakes the color of dried blood as conservators pried them apart inside the dim, temperature-controlled vault beneath the Charleston Historical Society. When the lid finally gave, a smell rose, soft at first, then unmistakable, an earthy sweetness, like lavender crushed into damp soil. Inside lay a folded linen dress, child-sized but sewn with the precision of a French tailor, its interior seams embroidered with letters so fine they seemed whispered rather than stitched. Beneath it rested a ledger of slave transactions from the summer of 1844, its ink brown to rust, its margins tattooed with symbols no historian on staff claimed to recognize. But the last item was the one that made the archivist step back and whisper for someone to bring a light. It was a small, framed miniature portrait of a girl, no older than 15, painted with a detail that felt impossibly lifelike. Her eyes, a pale storm gray, seemed fixed on the viewer with a knowing calm, a depth at odds with the soft curve of her youthful face. Her name, written beneath in a delicate hand, was Eden. And next to it, a single date, July 18th, 1844. The margin beside her name noted a sale price that dwarfed all others on the page, so high it seemed more ransom than purchase. No other enslaved person in Charleston, nor anywhere in the South, had ever been sold for such a sum. Within days of the trunk's discovery, whispers began among the town's old families. Some claimed the portrait should never have been unearthed. Others murmured that the girl's story had been buried not out of shame, but out of fear. A fear tied to a vanished household, 3 unexplained deaths, and a secret so potent it had once drawn physicians, priests, and plantation barons into a quiet war of influence. What happened to the girl called Eden? And why did some believe she never should have existed at all? Before we continue with the story of the girl whose sail shook Charleston, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. Charleston in 1844 lived and breathed through contrasts, splendor and rot pressed up against each other on every street. By dawn, the harbor's humid fog clung to the low rooftops like a shroud, muffling the calls of stevedores unloading cargo from schooners that had crossed from Cuba, Brazil, or the ivory trading outposts along the West African coast. The scent of salt, fish, and tar mingled with the sharper smell of horse sweat rising from the brick-lined alleys. Carriages rattled past St. Michael's Church, its bells chiming over a city where wealth was tallied not only in rice and cotton, but in human lives recorded as assets. The houses along East Bay and Meeting Street stood like monuments to a world determined to ignore its own decay. Their piazzas were painted white as bone, their shutters a dignified green meant to imitate the sea. Inside these homes, families drank imported Madeira and discussed European politics, while enslaved servants moved silently through the halls, ghosts in their own country. At the markets, Gullah women sold baskets woven tighter than any rope aboard a ship, singing in a soft cadence that rolled like tidewater. Children ran barefoot through the dust, their laughter cutting through the heat that settled over the city long before noon. Yet, beneath Charleston's genteel facade simmered an anxiety older than the Republic itself. Rumors of revolt still haunted the corridors of power, whispers that had lingered since the foiled Denmark-Vesey uprising 2 decades earlier. Legislators tightened their control with new patrols and harsher laws. Preachers thundered that order was God's will. But fear, true, bone-deep fear, tends to pool in the cracks that laws cannot seal. Plantation owners spoke in low voices about charms found buried at thresholds, about slaves who claimed to see spirits walking the cane fields at night, about doctors summoned to treat inexplicable fevers that struck without warning. Most dismissed such things as superstition, but a few, those who had lived through tragedies never printed in newspapers, understood that Charleston's peace was fragile, held together by rituals far older than the city itself. In the summer of 1844, the city swelled with travelers seeking fortune or influence. Slave auctions were at their yearly peak, drawing buyers from as far as Louisiana. The pens behind Ryan's mart buzzed with activity, though no visitor would ever mistake the sound as anything but suffering. Auctioneers called bids in clipped tones. Chains clinked. Mothers clutched children who might by afternoon no longer be theirs. Yet, in this brutal marketplace, where human beings were measured like cattle, one transaction would soon eclipse all others in both value and infamy. It was said that when the auctioneer unfurled the bill of sale for the girl called Eden, the assembled crowd went disturbingly silent. Some later insisted it was the heat that stilled them. Others claimed the auctioneer's hand trembled. But those who were present, those who dared remember, swore the silence came from her, from the strange stillness that clung to her like a second skin as she stood barefoot on the block, her eyes fixed on some distant horizon no one else could see. What followed that day became the kind of tale Charleston families only told within locked parlors, after the lamps were dimmed and the children sent upstairs. A tale stitched together from court records, diaries, plantation logs, and the fading memories of those who witnessed the impossible. The story of a girl whose price nearly ignited a private war, whose presence seemed to twist fate around her like a tightening vine, and whose disappearance left behind questions that haunted generations. And it begins here, in a city balancing on the precipice of wealth and ruin, faith and superstition, law and unspoken terror. A place where one girl's existence would soon unravel everything its people believed they understood about power, about humanity, and about the very nature of possession. The records from the period name three figures whose lives would become knotted around Eden's in ways none of them could have foreseen. Each stood on a different rung of Charleston's rigid hierarchy, yet all were drawn toward the girl as if compelled by some quiet, invisible gravity. Their letters, journals, and recorded testimonies provide the clearest window into the forces moving beneath the city's polished surface. And so the story must turn first to the man who purchased her. Dr. Nathaniel Archer, no relation to the New England writer whose fame was still gathering, was 37 in the summer of 1844, a physician of local renown. He lived in a tall, narrow house near the Battery, with ceilings so high they seemed to challenge the very concept of enclosure. Visitors recalled the faint, antiseptic smell that clung to him, a mixture of camphor oil and the chalky dust of crushed antimony he kept in small glass vials inside his coat. His hands were long-fingered and steady, the hands of a surgeon accustomed to cutting precisely, without tremor or hesitation. He carried a peculiar reputation, respected for his skill, distrusted for his curiosity. Some whispered that he spent too many evenings reading European medical texts that delved into the study of animal magnetism, mesmerism, and the possibility of inherited memories. Others claimed he had once traveled deep into the marshlands to treat a child who spoke in a language no one else understood. He denied most gossip with polite amusement, though not in a way that dispelled it. His own journal from June 1844 includes an entry that scholars still debate. It reads, "One does not choose what one recognizes. One simply knows when the moment arrives." The line is dated 17 days before Eden's auction. People who knew Archer described him as soft-spoken but intense, a man who seemed to hear things others did not. "You see the world too sharply," his sister reportedly told him one evening as he examined a series of botanical sketches. "It must make ordinary life unbearable." To which he replied with a small smile, "On the contrary, it is the ordinary that gives the strange its meaning." It was said he attended the auction at Ryan's Mart that sweltering July morning only to accompany a colleague. Yet when Eden stepped onto the block, something washed over his face. Surprise, then certainty. One witness, a trader named Elias Redman, later testified that Archer whispered under his breath, "It is her." When questioned about this during a legal inquiry months later, Archer claimed he had no memory of saying such a thing. Eden's next thread in this lattice of fate was Clara Beaumont, the 16-year-old daughter of Charleston's wealthiest shipping magnate. Clara lived in a sprawling manor whose long, shaded portico overlooked the Cooper River. Servants recalled the girl as restless, prone to wandering the grounds alone at dusk, humming melodies with no clear origin. Her hair was the color of sunlit straw, her skin so pale the heat often sent her indoors, dizzy and breathless. But it was her sensitivity that unsettled those around her. She seemed to feel too much, react too sharply to things others dismissed. Her governess, Mrs. Pembroke, once overheard Clara whispering into an empty room, "I'm not afraid of you. I know you're only here to watch." When asked whom she meant, Clara answered, "She hasn't arrived yet, but she will. I've seen her face." Her father attributed such remarks to nerves. Her mother insisted they came from a weak constitution. But a visiting clergyman, after a brief conversation with Clara in the garden, reportedly told Mrs. Beaumont, "Your daughter dreams in ways we are not meant to dream. You must keep her close." Clara first heard of Eden the same day Archer purchased her. The story goes that a servant mentioned the unusually high price during supper preparations, and Clara froze, her knife still hovering over a slice of bread. "What did you say she looked like?" she asked. The servant described gray eyes, a calm expression. Clara pressed the heel of her hand to her forehead and murmured, "Then it's true. She really exists." When Mrs. Pembroke later questioned her about this strange outburst, Clara replied, "I've known her since before I woke on this earth." The governess swore she felt a cold breeze move through the room at that very moment, though every window was shut tight. The final figure whose path soon intersected with Eden's was Jonah, a Gullah bondsman from St. Helena Island, known for his uncommon quiet. Jonah was tall, with shoulders shaped by years of hauling fishing nets across marsh flats, and eyes that carried a depth one rarely found in men who lived under constant threat of punishment. His voice was low but resonant, as though it rose from a place deeper than his lungs. Jonah belonged to the Middleton estate on Edisto, though he was often hired out for carpentry. He had learned the craft from his father, who had whispered stories in their Creole tongue as they worked, stories of spirits that walked beside the living, of ancestors who warned of danger through dreams. Jonah took these teachings seriously. When he first heard travelers murmuring about a girl sold at a price no man could justify, he stopped sharpening his chisel and listened. "A fellow bondsman," Isaiah described the moment. "He just froze," Isaiah recounted years later. Then he said, "A shadow been stirring. Somebody better watch what door they open." Isaiah laughed at him, telling him not to court trouble with talk like that. Jonah did not laugh. "Some things come looking for us," he said. "Some things come to be found." Jonah first saw Eden only once, from a distance, as Archer escorted her into a carriage outside the market. Later, he would say he felt something shift in the air, as if the world inhaled sharply. "She walked like she listening to something," Jonah explained it by being in testimony given after the catastrophe. "Like she hearing a sound none of us could hear." Jonah's peculiar intuition would draw him deeper into the unfolding mystery than anyone expected, though at this stage he was merely an observer, a man who sensed an approaching storm long before others could see the clouds gathering. These three individuals, Archer, Clara, Jonah, stood on different sides of Charleston's iron social divide. A doctor, a planter's daughter, a Gullah laborer. Yet the arrival of Eden pulled them into one another's orbits, linked by a thread that seemed older than their lifetimes, a thread none of them would recognize until it tightened around the city like a noose. Their voices, preserved through fragments of diaries and interrogations, foreshadow the strange convergence to come. In Archer's voice, "There are moments the world reveals itself. Not fully, but enough to suggest its design." In Clara's, I dreamed her before I ever heard her name. And in Jonah's, a spirit walking in daylight ain't ever a good sign. What bound them together would soon spill into Charleston streets, its parlors, its churches, and its darkest corners. And at the center of it all stood the girl whose portrait was hidden for generations, the girl whose existence should have been impossible. The first signs arrived quietly, so quietly that Charleston barely noticed them at all. But in hindsight, those closest to the event swore the city had begun to change the moment Eden stepped off the auction block and into Dr. Archer's carriage. They spoke of a shift in the air, a subtle tightening of atmosphere, as though something unseen had drawn its first waking breath. The earliest written account comes from Archer's own household servant, Ruth, who left behind a fragment of testimony during the later inquiries. The girl never made a sound that first night, she said. Not when we bathed her, not when we dressed her, not when she ate. She just looked at the window, like she was waiting on something to appear out in the dark. Ruth claimed that while brushing Eden's hair, a thick fall of black curls that seemed to hold more weight than hair ought to, she felt a faint vibration beneath the girl's skin. Like a humming, she said, pressing 2 fingers against her own wrist to demonstrate. Not from fever, not from fright, like she carried a sound inside her. Archer dismissed it as nerves, and the matter would have ended there had not other peculiarities begun to surface. On the second night, the doctor was awakened by a soft tapping coming from Eden's room. He lit a lamp, climbed the hallway stairs, and found the girl standing barefoot in the center of the floor. Her eyes were open, but Archer swore she was not truly awake. "What are you doing?" he asked gently, keeping his voice steady. Eden turned her head slowly toward him, her expression blank. "Listening," she whispered. "For what?" But she only blinked, as though the question puzzled her, and lay back down without another word. By morning, she remembered nothing. A few days later, a carriage driver reported seeing strange patterns drawn into the dust on the path just outside Archer's house. Circles intersecting with smaller circles, each loop connected by a straight, deliberate line. At first he thought them made by children, but the lines were clean, as though etched by a compass, and the carriage wheels had not disturbed them. When the driver knelt to trace one of the markings with his finger, he felt, just for an instant, a faint warmth rising from the earth. Word might not have spread beyond the household if not for Clara Beaumont's vision. Clara woke one night screaming, so violently that her mother ran to her bedside. The girl was shaking, gasping for breath. When Mrs. Beaumont begged her to explain, Clara held her hands over her ears and cried, "She's calling, but she's not speaking. She's calling in the way thunder calls the ground." Mrs. Beaumont later wrote in her diary that it took nearly an hour to calm her daughter. "She seemed consumed with a dread no child of her station should ever know," the entry read. "I fear she is slipping into a melancholic fantasy, but the terror in her eyes last night, it did not feel imagined." The next morning, Clara requested that her governess walk with her to the battery. The wind off the harbor whipped at her hair, sending pale strands across her face. She paused near the sea wall, staring out at the gray-blue churn of the water. "She's here," Clara murmured. "Who?" Mrs. Pembroke asked. "The girl with the storm in her eyes." When told that she had never met the newly purchased slave girl, Clara only shook her head. Some things you don't need to meet to know. Some things speak before they arrive. Meanwhile, miles away on the Middleton estate, Jonah woke before dawn with a heaviness in his chest. He stepped outside his quarters and found the marsh unnaturally still. Even the insects had quieted. He knelt, pressing his palm into the wet earth. The soil shivered under his hand, not from wind, not from distant thunder, but from something deeper. Old teaching stirred in him. His father had often warned, when the land holds its breath, a wandering spirit walks. Jonas whispered a brief prayer in the Gullah tongue, asking for clarity, for sight. But no answer came. Later that week, while repairing a fence rail near the shoreline, Jonas spotted a figure standing far across the marsh, too distant to recognize. The figure did not move, did not shift its weight, did not raise a hand in greeting. It simply watched. Jonah blinked, and it was gone. That same evening, as he washed his tools, Isaiah approached him. "You've been strange," Isaiah said, folding his arms. "Like you waiting on trouble." Jonah shook his head. "Trouble already here." "What kind?" Jonah didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the direction of Charleston, where the lamps of the city flickered faintly through the haze. "Something got bought that shouldn't have been sold," he murmured at last. "And it ain't done moving yet." By the end of July, rumors moved through Charleston like smoke. Thin at first, then darker. Servants whispered of a quiet girl who could stand perfectly still for hours, listening to something no one else could hear. Children playing near Archer Street claimed they saw a pale flicker in her window at night, like a lantern swinging in an unseen hand. And at the local apothecary, an elderly freedman reportedly muttered, "Sometimes the world sends warnings in human form. Best pray this one means no harm." People dismissed these murmurs as midsummer foolishness. Charleston loved a good whisper, and this seemed no different. But the truth was already coiling beneath the surface. The girl called Eden carried with her a silence that did not belong to silence at all, a silence alive with unfinished meaning. And those who sensed its depth found themselves unsettled, disoriented, and strangely vulnerable. Something had begun. None could name it yet, but all who crossed her path could feel it. The dread moved quietly, like a tide rising in the dark. Charleston's heat thickened as August pressed into the city, and with it came a deepening sense that something had gone quietly wrong. Not catastrophically yet, but wrong in the way a house feels wrong when a window has been left open overnight, letting in a draft that somehow smells of soil not belonging to the land, of footsteps not belonging to any living creature. It began with murmurs in Archer's own street, then reached the Battery, then seeped into the parlors of families who would later swear they never trafficked in superstition. But fear has its own logic, and Charleston in 1844 had long learned to trust the logic of fear. The first serious complaint came from Mrs. Lucinda Perrin, Archer's next-door neighbor, who stormed into his yard one morning clutching her croquet mallet like a club. Archer had been tending his medicinal herbs, a habit that brought him comfort when the city pressed too heavily upon him, when she stopped just short of the garden gate. "Dr. Archer," she said, breath short, cheeks burning, "you will explain yourself." He blinked at her with the calm confusion he often wore in social situations. "Madam, I'm at a loss. Explain myself for what?" "For the girl," she snapped. "The one you keep in that room facing my garden. She stares down at us as though she means to curse the ground we walk on." Archer straightened slowly, brushing soil from his palms. "Mrs. Perrin, Eden is a child. She has no interest in—" "She watches," Mrs. Perrin hissed. "Not like a child, like something older. Last night she stood at that window until near midnight. I called out for her to go inside. She did not blink. She did not move. She only watched." Archer felt a pulse of unease, faint but distinct. Perhaps she could not sleep. "No," Mrs. Perrin whispered. Her fingers tightened around the mallet. "No, doctor, sleep had nothing to do with it. She was waiting, and I want to know for what." Archer's reply, measured, courteous, did nothing to calm her. She left as abruptly as she arrived, muttering about writing a complaint to the city magistrate. That night Archer climbed the stairs more carefully than usual. Eden's room was lit only by a sliver of moonlight cutting across the floorboards. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring again at the window. "What are you looking for?" he asked gently. She didn't turn. "They move," she whispered. Who? Her breath shuddered. Not people. Archer crossed the room and knelt beside her. Eden, there is nothing outside. Only the Perrin's garden. She finally turned her head, and in the dim light, her storm-gray eyes seemed lit from within. They've been following since before I came here, she murmured. You don't see them because they're not for you. A chill moved along Archer's spine so suddenly he nearly dropped the lamp. Who told you such a thing? No one, she said. I just know. I just know. The same words he had written in his journal weeks before the auction. He did not sleep that night. Across town, the Beaumont household faced its own troubles. Clara's visions, once confined to dreams, had begun spilling over into waking hours. She would be sitting at breakfast when her gaze would suddenly go distant, unfocused, as though she were listening to a voice calling from the other side of a long corridor. Her mother grew desperate enough to summon Reverend Calloway, a tall, severe man whose sermons were known to reduce parishioners to trembling repentance. The clergyman found Clara seated at the piano, her hands hovering motionless above the keys. Clara, he said softly, your mother tells me you have been troubled. She looked up at him with eyes too old for her young face. It's not trouble, Reverend. It's recognition. Recognition of what? She lowered her hands to her lap. Of someone I knew before I was born. His jaw tightened. Child, do not speak of such things. The Lord forbids wandering thoughts. This isn't a thought, she said. It's a memory. Calloway exhaled slowly, fighting impatience. Tell me plainly, who is this person? Clara closed her eyes. A girl named Eden. Her mother gasped, but the clergyman's reaction was far more unsettling. His face went still, blank, almost pale. Where did you hear that name? He demanded. I didn't, Clara whispered. She said it. Who said it? Clara opened her eyes, and for a heartbeat they looked empty. The one who stands beside my bed at night. Calloway recoiled as though struck. Mrs. Beaumont covered her mouth to stifle a cry. But Clara only sighed, fragile and tired, as though the weight of knowing something impossible was wearing her thin. 2 days later, the Reverend visited Dr. Archer unannounced. They had met before, but theirs was a strained relationship. Calloway considered Archer too enamored with European ideas, and Archer considered Calloway too enamored with fear. Archer welcomed him inside with cordiality but no warmth. I'll not waste your time, Calloway said. Tell me plainly, what do you know of the girl in your care? Archer stiffened. She is a human being, Reverend, not a curiosity. That is not what I asked. Then you must specify your meaning. Calloway leaned forward, voice low. Have you seen anything? Heard anything? Has she spoken of matters beyond her station or understanding? Archer's eyes narrowed. Eden is traumatized, not possessed. I said nothing of possession. But you meant it. Calloway gripped the back of a chair so tightly the wood creaked. There are things stirring in this city, Doctor. Things I have not felt since the Vesey executions. Something dark has been roused. Archer's reply was sharp, colder than he intended. Fear is not evidence. Calloway stepped close enough that Archer caught the faint scent of incense clinging to his coat. Then answer me this. Why does my parishioner, who has never laid eyes on your girl, speak her name in her sleep? Archer had no answer to give, and Calloway seemed to take silence as concession. You are playing with forces you do not comprehend, the Reverend warned. And if you do not put an end to it, the city will suffer. He left without accepting refreshment, leaving Archer unsettled in a way that rational explanations could not soothe. While Charleston's elite whispered behind shutters, Jonah on St. Helena felt the tension manifest in more tangible forms. Animals behaved strangely. Cattle refused to drink from the troughs, staring instead toward the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. Birds gathered in clusters high in the pines, making no sound at all, unnatural silence from creatures whose chatter usually filled the air. One night Isaiah found Jonah sitting by a dying fire, head bowed. "You sick?" Isaiah asked. "No." Jonah rubbed his palms together. "Just listening." "To what?" "The same thing that girl listening to," he said. "The same thing walking behind the Beaumont child. Something that don't belong here." Isaiah shook his head. "You're reading too much into little things." "This ain't little." Jonah lifted his gaze, and Isaiah felt a tremor of unease. "Somebody open a door," Jonah said softly. "Maybe not meaning to, but once something cross over, it don't always cross back alone." Isaiah stepped back. "You talking devil scripture?" "No," Jonah said. "I talking about the old truths from before any man brought a Bible to this land." Isaiah left him, unsettled, repeating under his breath that Jonah was letting fear cloud his mind. But Jonah knew fear was not the teacher here. Something else was. The final spark that ignited the city's growing suspicion came during a violent storm that swept through Charleston one humid night. Trees bent like bowing giants. The river churned against the seawall. Lamps blew out in windows across town. And in Archer's home, Eden stood in the center of her room, trembling violently. Archer rushed to her. "What is it? What's happening?" She clutched at his sleeve with a grip far stronger than her small frame suggested. "They're here," she whispered. "They found me." Lightning split the sky. Thunder shook the walls. Archer pulled her into his arms. "Who found you? Tell me." But she only shook her head, eyes fixed on some invisible presence gathering near the corner of the room. The storm raged for hours, and when it passed, the entire city felt altered, like a body after fever, dazed and weakened. The next morning, Reverend Calloway delivered a sermon so forceful that even the doubters grew pale. He spoke of hidden sins, of ancient evils disguised in human suffering, of spirits that wander when the boundary between worlds thins. He did not mention Eden by name. He didn't need to. Every family with an ear close to rumor had already begun asking the same question. What exactly had Dr. Archer brought into their city, and why did it feel like something unseen was drawing nearer? Charleston, once merely uneasy, now simmered with suspicion. Of Archer, of Eden, of themselves, of the strange convergence of events that felt too synchronized to be coincidental. Fear moved like fog, slipping beneath doors. And the worst had not yet begun. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Charleston had weathered hurricanes, fires, outbreaks of fever, but the dread unfolding in the late summer of 1844 did not move like any of those calamities. It had no sound, no color, no defined edges. It seeped rather than struck. It whispered rather than roared. And the people who first sensed its shape carried the weight of that knowledge long before the rest of the city began to understand that something unnatural and unmistakably dangerous had settled among them. For Dr. Archer, the shift began with small inconsistencies in Eden's health. She would slump with exhaustion at unpredictable intervals, her pulse dropping to a slow, rhythmic thud barely perceptible beneath his fingertips. Then, hours later, she would wake with renewed synchronicity, as though her body had realigned to some inner clock only she could hear. Archer recorded everything in his papers: pulse rate, breathing patterns, dreams articulated in half-coherent murmurs. But even his meticulous notes could not explain the phenomenon he witnessed one humid evening in August. Eden had collapsed in the hallway. her small frame trembling. Archer carried her to his study, laying her gently on the fainting couch beside the window. Her lips were pale, and her breath came shallow. Too shallow. "Stay with me," Archer whispered, placing 2 fingers against her neck. Her pulse flickered like a candle in a draught. "Listen to my voice," he said, trying to steady her breathing with his own. But when she opened her eyes, he saw something he could not accept. Her pupils had dilated until her irises were almost gone, creating a black, reflective surface. The change lasted only a heartbeat, but it rooted him with a terror he had never felt, not even during his early years dissecting cadaver after cadaver in the unforgiving cold of Edinburgh's medical lecture halls. "Doctor," Eden whispered. "Yes, child?" "It's not my breath they're taking," she murmured. "It's something deeper." Her eyes fluttered closed. Archer held her wrist and felt the pulse returning slowly, reluctantly, as though it were being fed back into her from an unseen source. That night, long after Ruth had retired and the household grew silent, Archer sat in his study, staring at the candle flame. He replayed Eden's words again and again. "Not my breath they're taking. They, plural." He wrote the word on a scrap of paper, stared at it, crossed it out, rewrote it, and finally, with trembling hand, burned the paper in the candle flame. Even the most rational mind will sometimes attempt to destroy a truth it cannot bear to confront. While Archer wrestled with his private fears, Clara Beaumont's world was unraveling at a far more public pace. Her mother could no longer hide her daughter's trembling hands at dinner, nor her tendency to lose track of minutes, sometimes whole hours, as she sat staring at the carved molding along the parlor ceiling. Clara had begun sketching too, compulsively, filling pages with looping shapes that her mother could not decipher. Some looked like tides circling a center point. Others resembled concentric circles broken by jagged lines. But several sketches bore a figure, a girl standing at the heart of the circles, her hair a dark cloud around her face. Clara never labeled the drawings. She didn't need to. One afternoon, Mrs. Penbrook found her in the upstairs sewing room, lying on the floor beside a shattered mirror. Clara's hands were cut from where she'd tried to pick up the glass. "Clara," the governess cried. "What happened? Did you fall?" "No," Clara whispered. "She stepped out." "Who stepped?" Clara pressed her fingers against her temples. "Not like a person. Not with feet. She stepped through." Mrs. Penbrook paled, fetching bandages with shaking hands. "I'm not losing my mind," Clara said softly. "It feels like remembering, don't you see? I think I've known Eden for years, longer. I think I've been waiting for her." Waiting for what, she could not say. The Beaumont's cook spread rumors faster than Mrs. Beaumont could quash them. Soon, Charleston's wealthiest households whispered that the Beaumont girl was either cursed, bewitched, or sliding into the kind of melancholia that often ended with a cloistered attic room and a locked door. But none of them dared speak aloud the detail all of them privately feared. Clara had spoken the forbidden girl's name, and the name itself had begun to carry weight. On St. Helena, Jonah felt the city's spiritual atmosphere shift as tangibly as a seasoned sailor feels changing weather. He began waking from dreams soaked in sweat, though he could never remember more than a sliver. Dark water, a distant humming, shadows moving just beyond the reach of firelight. One morning, Isaiah found Jonah standing ankle-deep in the marsh at daybreak, staring toward Charleston. "What do you think you're seeing?" Isaiah asked. "Not seeing," Jonah murmured. "Hearing. Everything quiet, too quiet, like the land listening to something calling from far away." Isaiah spat into the mud. "You talk like old storytellers." Jonah turned, and a sadness settled in his voice. Old stories come from somewhere. Later that day, a patrol rider from Charleston passed through the island, warning the plantation overseer that the city was on edge. Churches full, rumors thick. When Jonah quietly asked about Archer's household, the writer paused. "Some say the doctor's girl's got a sickness that ain't from fever," the man muttered. "Others say she brings misfortune. Gardeners refusing to work near the parents' fence. Couple of families talking about leaving town early for the season." Jonah felt a coldness bloom in his chest. "What they mean, misfortune?" he asked. The writer shrugged. "Just tales. Broken mirrors, animals spooked. A child in the Perrin household waking up screaming about a woman standing at her window, though Mrs. Perrin swears no such person was ever there." Jonah's throat tightened. He thought of the figure he'd seen across the marsh weeks ago, motionless, watching. "I need to go into the city," he said quietly. Isaiah grabbed his arm. "If Overseer find you gone—" "I won't run," Jonah said. "But something happening there, and I need to see it with my own eyes." Isaiah hesitated, then released him. "You come back by sundown." But Jonah didn't promise. Charleston greeted him with heat and tension. The markets hummed with a nervous hush, traders speaking in quieter tones. Church bells rang more frequently, too frequently. Jonah walked past a group of women outside St. Philip's S., one clutching a rosary so tightly her knuckles whitened. Inside Ryan's Mart, where Eden had been sold, the old auctioneer leaned against a post, eyes shadowed. "Bad business," he muttered to Jonah, though they had never met. "City's breathing wrong. You can feel it in the boards." Jonah asked nothing. He simply listened. "Some say Archer's girl was born under an ill sign," the man went on. "Some say she's touched by something that ain't earthly. If she were a grown woman, they'd call her a witch. But she's a child, so they call her cursed." Jonah clenched his jaw. "You see her?" "Aye," the man said. "And don't ask me what I saw in her eyes. I won't speak it." Jonah left with a heaviness in his chest. As he walked toward Archer's street, he spotted a familiar carriage near the Beaumont estate. Clara was inside, staring out the window. When her eyes met Jonah's, she did not look startled. Instead, she looked relieved, as though recognizing an old friend from a forgotten place. She lifted a hand, beckoning him closer. Jonah hesitated, then approached. "Do you know her too?" Clara asked softly through the open window. Her mother and coachman were too far ahead to hear. "Who?" Jonah replied, though he already knew. "Eden," Clara whispered. "The girl whose shadow doesn't match her body." Jonah's breath caught. "What you mean?" Clara blinked slowly, and her voice grew distant. "I saw it. Not in waking eyes. In the memory beneath memory. Something walks with her, something that isn't shaped like us." Before Jonah could ask more, Mrs. Beaumont called sharply, and the carriage lurched forward. Clara watched Jonah until the vehicle rounded the bend. He stood in the road long after she was gone. When Jonah finally reached Archer's house, the doctor answered the door with startled eyes. "Do I know you?" Archer asked. "No," Jonah said, "but I know you need help." Archer froze. "What are you talking about?" Jonah met his gaze. "The girl. The things around her. You feel it too." Archer exhaled slowly, as though trying to steady himself. "Who sent you?" "Nobody," Jonah said. "Land sent me. Dreams sent me." Archer stared at him, an unfamiliar mixture of fear and hope flickering across his features. "The girl isn't possessed," Archer whispered. "I ain't say she was," Jonah replied. "But something following her. You know that much." Archer opened the door wider. "Come in." They spoke for nearly an hour, quietly, urgently, while Eden slept in the room above them. Jonah didn't pretend to know the nature of the presence surrounding her, only that it had stepped into their world through her, or because of her, or for her. Archer shared his concerns, his observations, his doubts, as a man of science forced to confront something he could neither quantify nor deny. "If I could understand the pattern," Archer murmured, "I might protect her." Jonah shook his head. "Protection ain't the question. Question is whether what walk with her mean harm, or call for something." Archer swallowed. "Call for what?" Jonah's voice dropped to a whisper. "A price." In the days that followed, Charleston's unease escalated to something more volatile. A child in the Perrin household fell mysteriously ill, muttering Eden's name in fevered delirium. A fisherman claimed he saw a figure standing on the seawall at dawn, too still to be human, too shadowed to be wholly present. Clara Beaumont collapsed during communion, whispering, "She's close. I feel her near my bones." And rumors spread that Reverend Calloway had begun preparing a sermon unlike any he'd delivered before, one not of warning, but of outright accusation. More eyes turned toward Archer's home. More superstition curled like smoke around Eden's name. More fear crept along Charleston's streets. Something was coming, something tightening, something ready to reveal itself. And when it did, the city would never again claim ignorance. Revelation did not arrive in Charleston with spectacle. Not at first. It came with a quietness so profound that those who felt it would later struggle to describe it. A hush in the air, a pressure behind the ribs, a faint sense that the world was tilting ever so slightly, away from the known, toward the unseen. But once the unveiling began, there was no stopping it. The first unmistakable sign came on a night thick with heat, when even the cicadas fell silent. Dr. Archer was examining Eden's latest fainting spell when a sudden vibration passed through the floorboards, subtle, like the tremor of a distant carriage. Except no wheels clattered, no hooves struck the stones outside. The vibration came again, stronger. Ruth, working in the kitchen, dropped a ladle and crossed herself. The lamp flames along the hall guttered in unison. Eden's eyes flew open. "They're at the door," she whispered. Archer felt a coldness bloom beneath his sternum. "Who is they, Eden? Tell me." But before she could answer, every lamp in the house extinguished at once. Ruth screamed downstairs. Archer snatched a candle and struck a match with trembling fingers. The flame sputtered, steadied, and revealed Eden standing not on the couch where she had lain seconds earlier, but in the center of the study. Her posture was rigid, her eyes unfocused, her breath slow. "Eden," Archer whispered, stepping toward her. She didn't blink, didn't move. And then she spoke, but not in English. A sound passed through her lips, a resonance more than a language. Low, layered, melodic in a way that made Archer's scalp tighten. He had heard tongues from far corners of the world. Gaelic, Ewe, Arabic, the Creoles spoken along the Carolina coast. But this was none of those. This was a harmonic tone, rising and falling in patterns that stirred some primal memory inside him, something ancient and disquieting. "Eden," he tried again. "Can you hear me?" But her voice only deepened into a second phrase, the tone wrapping around itself like twisting vines. A knock sounded at the front door. Not a frantic knock, not a visitor's knock. A measured, deliberate rhythm. 3 slow strikes. A pause. 3 more. Jonah, who had been on his way to the house, felt the sound reverberate through the air before he heard it. He froze on the walkway, hand hovering near the gate. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest hint of brine, odd given that the tide was low. He took one step forward, then another, then stopped entirely, eyes narrowing. Someone, or something, was standing at the far end of the street. The figure was tall. Too tall. Its proportions slightly wrong, though Jonah couldn't explain why. A trick of the lamplight, perhaps, or the hour, or the dread curling in the pit of his stomach. He whispered an old protection prayer under his breath. The figure vanished. Inside, Archer made his way to the front door with the candle trembling in his hand. Ruth peeked from the kitchen doorway, whispering, "Don't open it, sir. Don't you open that door." But the knock came again, slow, rhythmic, unhurried. Archer steadied himself. "Show yourself," he called. "Who's there?" Silence. He reached for the latch. The instant he touched it, a violent crash shook the entire house, not from outside, but from upstairs. Archer dropped the candle. Ruth screamed again. Archer sprinted to the upper floor, heart hammering. Eden was gone. The window of her room was open, curtains whipping in the faint breeze. Archer rushed to the sill. The street lay empty, no carriage, no passerby, nothing but shadows. A whisper came from behind him. "Doctor!" He spun toward the door. Clara Beaumont stood there, barefoot, her nightdress damp with sweat, her hair tangled as though she'd run all the way from her home. Archer's blood ran cold. "Clara, how did you—" "I had to come," she gasped. "She called me." "Who called?" "Eden," Clara whispered, stepping into the room. "She's not missing. She's being taken or returning. I don't know which." Before Archer could reply, Clara's eyes rolled upward and she collapsed onto the floor. He dropped to his knees beside her, checking her pulse, rapid, erratic. "Clara, stay with me," he urged. Her eyes fluttered open. "She's at the old church," Clara murmured. "The one they bricked after the revolt. The voices go there." Archer froze. Old St. Matthew S. A chapel abandoned after the Vesey conspiracy, sealed by city order, rumored to be haunted. He lifted Clara into his arms and carried her downstairs. Jonah burst through the front door just as Archer reached the base of the staircase. "She gone," Jonah said, breathless. "I feel it in the air." Archer nodded grimly. "We're going after her." Jonah looked at Clara, limp in Archer's arms. "She coming too?" "She knows where Eden is," Archer said. "Or something does." Jonah placed a hand gently on Clara's forehead, murmured in Gullah, then stepped back. "Spirit's riding her, but they ain't meaning harm, not yet." Ruth clung to the banister. "Doctor, don't you go chasing shadows in the dead of night." Archer met her eyes. "We're not chasing shadows. We're saving a child." The three of them stepped into the street. The night felt wrong, too still, too heavy, as though the air itself were listening. Archer and Jonah carried Clara between them as they headed toward the abandoned church at the edge of the old quarter. Charleston's cobbled streets felt foreign at night, a maze of narrow passages where lamplight faltered and darkness gathered in corners like pooled ink. As they passed St. Philip's S, the great bell tolled once, though no one touched the rope at this hour. Jonah flinched at the sound. "Bad sign," he muttered. Archer tightened his grip on Clara. "We don't have time for omens." "You don't choose omens," Jonah said quietly. "They choose you." They continued toward the old district where houses leaned crookedly, their shutters sagging, their thresholds choked with vines. The air grew colder. At last the bricked shell of St. Matthew's loomed before them, a hulking silhouette against the starless sky. The structure had been sealed years ago. But now, the bricks around the door lay scattered across the ground. Something, or someone, had broken its way inside. A faint glow flickered from within, like candlelight, but unsteady, pulsing. Archer and Jonah exchanged a glance. "We go together," Jonah said. "No matter what we see." Archer nodded. They entered. Inside, dust motes swirled like drifting spirits. The church pews, once orderly, now sat askew, as though shoved aside by a giant hand. The altar lay splintered. and on the far end of the sanctuary, beneath the half-collapsed choir loft, Eden stood alone. Clara stirred in Archer's arms. "Put me down," she whispered. Archer obeyed. Clara stepped forward slowly, her bare feet leaving faint prints in the dust. Eden turned toward her, not startled, not afraid, simply aware. Clara stopped before her. "It's you," she whispered. Eden nodded. "You heard them too." A soft hum began to fill the space, low, rhythmic. The same sound Eden had spoken earlier. Archer felt it vibrating in his ribs. Jonah stiffened. "They coming?" Eden lifted her hand. The shadows in the church shifted, darkness shifting independently of light, rising along the walls like ink spreading through water. Archer's pulse thundered. "Eden, what is this? What are you doing?" "I didn't bring them," she said. "They follow." "Why?" he demanded. She looked down. "Because I'm the door." A wind swept through the church, though no window was open. The hum deepened, becoming layered. Voices within voices, tones within tones. Clara clutched her head. "It's too loud," she gasped, though Archer heard no sound beyond the hum. Jonah stepped between the girls and the shifting darkness. "What walked through you?" he demanded. "What calling your name?" Eden tilted her face toward him. "Not my name, hers." She pointed at Clara. Archer's breath caught. "Clara!" Clara's knees buckled. Archer caught her before she fell. "You said you dreamed her," Archer whispered. "But what if it wasn't a dream? What if it was a memory?" Clara trembled violently. "She's part of me," she whispered. "Or I am part of her." Eden nodded. "We were one before. We're two now." The shadows surged. Jonah shouted, stepping back. "Doctor, they ain't spirits. They something else. Something old." Archer pulled Clara close, shielding her. "What do they want?" Eden stepped forward. And for the first time her voice did not sound like the voice of a child. "They want the missing part," she said. Clara's breath hitched. The darkness condensed, forming shapes, not human shapes. Something impossible, angular, shifting between dimensions like silhouettes pressed against a veil. Archer whispered, "Dear God." Jonah grabbed Archer's shoulder. "Don't speak God's name in here. This ain't his house tonight." The shadows reached toward Clara. Eden stepped between them. "Not yet," she said. The shadows recoiled. The hum stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. Archer felt the collapse coming before he understood it. The church groaned, a deep, seismic rumble. Jonah shouted, "A roof coming down!" Archer pulled Clara toward the exit. Jonah grabbed Eden. The ceiling buckled. Light, blinding white, unnatural, erupted from the space where the shadows had gathered. Archer stumbled into the street with Clara. Jonah emerged behind him, carrying Eden. The church behind them roared as the choir loft crashed inward, dust billowing like smoke. And then, silence. Eden lay unconscious in Jonah's arms. Clara clung to Archer, shaking. The church, a place sealed after bloodshed, a place feared for years, had given up its final secret. Something had been trying to cross, and Eden had been the threshold. Clara had been the missing half. And the city, blinded by superstition and pride, had been standing on the edge of something catastrophic, long before anyone realized what they were truly dealing with. As the dust settled, Jonah whispered, "That wasn't the end." Archer closed his eyes. He knew Jonah was right. It was only the beginning. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. Dawn crept over Charleston with a hesitant blood-orange glow, as though even the sun approached the city with caution after what had transpired in the abandoned church. The storm of dust had settled in the streets by the time the first market vendors rose, but something far heavier clung to the air, an unease that found its way into breakfast parlors, into the hushed exchanges between servants, into the posture of every passerby who glanced too long at the ruins of St. Matthew's S. Within hours, word began to spread. Not the truth. No, the truth was far too large, too unbelievable, too dangerous to be carried openly. Instead, it traveled in fragments, broken like bits of glass, each person picking up a different shard. Some said the old church collapsed because a vagrant started a fire. Others claimed the Beaumont girl was seen running barefoot through the quarter, screaming of visions. A few whispered that Dr. Archer had been toying with illegal experiments, and that one had gone horribly, fatally wrong. Rumor was the city's preferred method of self-defense. It kept the unexplainable safely blurred. By early morning, Charleston's authorities descended upon the scene. The magistrate arrived sweating beneath his wool coat. A pair of city constables sealed the church grounds with rope. A labor crew stood by with orders to assess whether the structure could be salvaged or must be brought down entirely. Dr. Nathaniel Archer stood apart from them all, his coat powdered with dust, his face drawn tight with exhaustion and dread. "Doctor," the magistrate barked, "you will tell me why you were inside a sealed structure with 2 miners in the middle of the night." Archer's throat tightened. He had rehearsed 6 explanations on the walk here, yet none seemed adequate. There were concerns regarding the missing girl. A sighting. I believed she had wandered inside. The magistrate's eyes narrowed. And Clara Beaumont, how did she come to be involved? Archer hesitated. He could not say she was summoned, nor she knew what I could not, nor the shadows reached for her as though she were already theirs. "She followed against my instruction," he said carefully. "When I realized, I brought her out at once." A brittle pause. The magistrate exhaled, impatient. "The Beaumonts are in hysterics, Doctor. Do you grasp the severity of this situation? A child of their standing, pulled into a collapsed ruin." "Pulled," Archer snapped, forgetting caution. "No one pulled anyone." The magistrate's mustache bristled. "Mind yourself, sir. You are already skating on the edge of formal charges." Archer forced himself to look away, to calm the trembling that threatened to expose him. Jonah stood a few paces behind, arms crossed tightly, gaze locked on the broken church door. He had refused to leave Eden's side until the constables forced him back. The magistrate turned his attention to him next. "You," he said sharply. "You were seen carrying the Archer girl from the wreckage. By what authority were you on this property at all?" Jonah did not answer at first. He simply continued looking at the church, as though listening to something still shifting among the ruins. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I came because she called." The magistrate stiffened. "She? Are you referring to the missing slave girl?" Jonah nodded once. "And you expect me to believe you were summoned?" The man scoffed. "More superstition, more nonsense. This city is drowning in it." Jonah turned then, meeting the magistrate's gaze with a slow, quiet intensity. "Believe what you want, but what happened in that church ain't nonsense." A constable stepped forward. "Watch your tone, boy." Jonah said nothing more. The magistrate waved dismissively. "If the girl is found, and I pray she is, you, Dr. Archer, will provide a full written account to prevent further fanciful interpretations of events." Archer gave a tight nod, though the thought of attempting to write a coherent narrative of that night felt impossible. Ink could not hold what they had seen. The Beaumonts sent for Clara almost immediately. Their carriage arrived with such haste that dust kicked up along Archer's street. Mrs. Beaumont practically leapt from the cabin, tears streaking her powdered cheeks. "Clara!" she cried, gathering the trembling girl into her arms. My darling, my God, what did that man involve you in?" Archer felt the words burrow into him like barbs. Clara, pale but conscious, lifted her head. "Mother, I went because I had to." "You had nothing of the sort," her mother snapped. "Do not speak it again." But Clara's eyes drifted past her mother's shoulder, toward Jonah, toward the shattered church beyond. "They'll come back," she whispered. Mrs. Beaumont shuddered. "Hush, Clara. Enough of that talk. Reverend Calloway will perform a cleansing prayer this afternoon." Clara didn't respond. As Mrs. Beaumont ushered her daughter into the carriage, she turned a cold gaze on Archer. "You will never approach my child again. Do you understand?" Archer lowered his eyes. "I understand." He did not miss the look Clara cast toward him, fearful, apologetic, weighted with the knowledge that something bound them still. Then the carriage was gone. By midday, the church collapse dominated conversation across Charleston. Merchants closed their shutters early. Housewives forbade their children from wandering the streets. A strange, oppressive quiet hovered over the city center. And above all, one question burned through every whispered exchange. Where was Eden? Some said she had perished in the collapse, buried under the choir loft. Others claimed she had been spirited away by Archer to conceal some medical atrocity. A few, those who followed the darker rumblings, insisted she had been taken by unseen forces, reclaimed by whatever power had marked her from birth. None of them were entirely wrong. By sunset, the courier printed a brief notice. A minor of unknown parentage, recently under the care of Dr. N. Archer, remains missing following last night's structural failure at Old St. Matthew S. Authorities urge calm and petition citizens to come forward with any relevant information. But calm was a luxury the city did not possess. Reverend Calloway delivered an emergency sermon that evening. The sanctuary overflowed, worshippers pressing into the aisles, fanning themselves with hymn books. "This city," Calloway thundered, "has permitted darkness to whisper among us. We have indulged mystery where clarity should reign. We have allowed foreign spirits, unclean spirits, to tempt the innocent and cloud the vision of our youth." The congregation murmured in fear. Calloway slammed his palm upon the pulpit. "Something walks unseen. It circles our households, touches our children's dreams, and until it is confronted, cast out, we are all in peril." Jonah heard pieces of this sermon repeated later that night as he walked along the waterfront, trying to steady his thoughts. He knew the Reverend was wrong in some ways, right in others, blind in the most important ones. Darkness had not come to Charleston. It had been here, waiting. This was merely the moment it stepped forward. City officials summoned Archer for formal questioning the next morning. The hearing took place inside a long, echoing chamber of the courthouse, where, decades earlier, enslaved men had been sentenced in hurried, brutal trials after Vesey's plot. Archer stood before the panel, hands clasped behind his back. "Doctor," one official began, "witnesses claim you engaged in midnight rituals, that you allowed a gullible laborer access to your household during unusual hours, and that you encouraged a minor, Miss Beaumont, to engage in improper excursions." "False," Archer said firmly. "I sought only to retrieve a missing child." A second magistrate leaned forward. "But the circumstances, Doctor. Why pursue her into a condemned structure? Why involve persons outside your household? Why not inform the authorities?" Archer swallowed. "Because I feared time was precious." "Feared what, exactly?" He hesitated. Every truthful answer sounded like madness. Harm," Archer said finally. "One I cannot yet define." The panel exchanged uneasy looks. None of them understood the shape of the threat, but all sensed that Archer did, and that he was holding it too close. The questioning continued for an hour. By the end, Archer was not charged with wrongdoing, yet neither was he absolved. Suspicion lingered like a shadow at his heel. When he exited the courthouse, Jonah was waiting outside. "Well?" Jonah asked. "For now, nothing," Archer said. "You think they're gonna let it rest?" Archer shook his head. "No, they're frightened. Frightened people demand answers, even if the answers are wrong." Jonah nodded slowly. "And what you gonna tell them when they ask again?" Archer looked toward St. Matthew's, its broken spire jutting against the sky. "The truth," he said quietly, "even if they refuse it." Jonah exhaled. "Then we ain't done." "No," Archer replied. "We're only beginning to understand." Newspapers speculated. Churches filled. Social clubs debated. Servants whispered that Eden's portrait, yes, there had been a portrait, was seen with its eyes subtly changed. The gray deepened. The gaze sharpened, as though she were watching from beyond. Mrs. Perrin, who had once demanded Archer contain the girl, refused to leave her home, convinced something prowled the garden at night. Children claimed they dreamed of a black-haired girl standing at the foot of their beds, silent and solemn. And Clara Beaumont. Clara remained bedridden, pale as wax, murmuring phrases not in her own voice. Charleston trembled beneath the weight of a mystery it could neither name nor bury. A city steeped in centuries of superstition and cruelty now found itself facing something older than both. And in homes from the Battery to the marshlands, families asked the same question. Was the missing girl an innocent, or the hinge upon which something monstrous had begun to turn? Charleston did not heal after the collapse of St. Matthew. It recoiled. The city's social order, normally rigid and confident, bent under the weight of uncertainty. People walked faster, doors shut earlier, churches overflowed with worshippers muttering about omens. And in every corner of town, one name lingered like the aftertaste of bitter medicine: Eden. The authorities launched a formal inquiry within days. The official aim was to determine the cause of the collapse, though no one doubted the unspoken motive: to assign blame. A missing enslaved girl, a prominent physician, an elite family's endangered daughter. This was not a mystery the city could leave to rumor. The inquiry convened in the same courthouse chamber where Archer had earlier defended himself. But now the room was crowded. Magistrates, church leaders, merchants, and a collection of men who believed themselves the arbiters of Charleston's moral health. Jonah was summoned first. He entered quietly, head bowed. An overseer from his plantation sat behind him like a shadow, making sure his presence remained tolerable to the city's white elite. "State your name," the chief magistrate ordered. "Jonah Middleton," he replied. "And you claim you entered Dr. Archer's home the night of the incident at the church?" "Yes." "And why?" Jonah looked up, meeting the man's eyes with a steadiness that unsettled the room. "To protect the girl." "You mean the Archer girl? The enslaved one?" He nodded. The magistrate leaned back. "What danger did you believe she was in?" Jonah hesitated. His voice softened, almost reverent. "Something was following her." A murmur rippled across the chamber. "You mean a person?" the magistrate pressed. "No." "An animal?" "No." "Then what?" Jonah inhaled slowly. "Something not from our world?" The room stiffened. A low scoff came from one of the merchants, loud enough to signify ridicule, soft enough to preserve deniability. The magistrate's jaw tensed. "We are not here to discuss superstitions. Stick to the facts." Jonah held the man's gaze. "That is fact, sir." His tone contained no defiance, only truth. That made it more dangerous. The magistrates dismissed him shortly after, unwilling to hear more. Clara Beaumont's testimony was demanded next. Mrs. Beaumont protested. Her daughter was in no condition to face public questioning, but the magistrates insisted. Clara was escorted into the chamber pale and trembling, escorted by 2 maids and the stern figure of Reverend Calloway. "Miss Beaumont," the chief magistrate began gently, "do you remember entering Old St. Matthew's the night of its collapse?" Clara's eyes drifted toward the far window. "Not entering," she murmured, "only being pulled." A ripple of discomfort swept the room. "Pulled by whom?" She shook her head slowly. "Not who. What?" Calloway stepped forward. "The girl is disoriented. Trauma makes children speak in metaphors." But Clara continued as though she hadn't heard him. "They weren't trying to hurt me. Not at first. They were trying to find the missing part." "Part of what?" a magistrate asked, barely disguising his alarm. Clara lifted her trembling hand and pressed it against her sternum. "Part of her, and part of me." "Mrs." Beaumont gasped. "Clara, no!" Clara sagged against her chair, eyes closing briefly before opening again with a distant clarity. "We were once one soul. I know that now." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Reverend Calloway stepped forward sharply. "Enough. This child is unwell. These delusions are the product of demonic disturbance. She must be protected, not interrogated." But Clara's last words had already landed like stones dropped into a still pond, creating ripples, creating fractures. Clara was escorted out, her mother in tears, Calloway fuming. When Archer himself was called, he knew the room awaited him with a hunger for both answers and condemnation. The chief magistrate adjusted his spectacles. "Doctor, we will ask you directly. Did you engage in occult experimentation?" "No," Archer said. "Did you hypnotize or manipulate the children involved?" "No." "Did you attempt to summon spirits, foreign or otherwise?" Archer's eyes flashed. "Of course not." "Then how?" the magistrate said, rising from his seat. "Do you explain the collapse of St. Matthew's SS, the disappearance of the enslaved girl, and the delirium of Clara Beaumont?" Archer inhaled slowly. This was the moment where he could lie, or bury the truth in medical terminology, or plead ignorance. Instead, he did the one thing no one expected. He told the truth. "A presence followed Eden," he said quietly. "Something I cannot identify by human science. I witnessed its movement. I felt its pressure. It caused the collapse, not intentionally, but by its proximity." The room erupted into outrage. Several magistrates shouted over one another. A merchant declared the doctor insane. Reverend Calloway rose with fire in his eyes. "Dr. Archer," Calloway thundered, "you dare bring pagan mysticism into this chamber and call it truth?" Archer's voice remained steady. "Because it is." Calloway slammed his fist on the table. "This is blasphemy!" Archer's calm broke at last. "Truth is not blasphemy, Reverend." Silence fell, cold and immediate. The magistrates whispered among themselves. Finally, the chief magistrate raised a hand. "Dr. Archer, you will remain under supervised watch until this matter is resolved. You are not under arrest, yet, but you are not free to move about the city without reporting your movements." Archer nodded without protest. He expected no less. The inquiry adjourned, but its impact rippled outward like shock waves. Charleston had heard the word presence. Charleston had heard one soul becoming two. Charleston had heard something not from our world. People began barricading their doors at night. Children were kept inside. Servants carried charms in their pockets, unseen but ever present. The wealthy summoned priests, conjured doctors, or both. Some families fled the city entirely, claiming business elsewhere. Newspapers published cautious editorials urging calm, yet also repeating, between the lines, the city's terror. The Mercury wrote, "The unrest at Old St. Matthew's signifies not merely a structural failure, but a moral one." The Courier printed, "The disappearance of the enslaved girl, Eden, must be viewed in light of the spiritual disarray gripping our city. Citizens should remain vigilant." Reverend Calloway delivered sermon after sermon condemning the corruption of the natural order. Rumor turned Archer into either a monster or a martyr, depending on who spoke. Clara was kept in seclusion, visited only by physicians and priests. Jonah was forbidden to leave his plantation without supervision. And Eden became a story rather than a person. A warning. A curse. A symbol of something Charleston feared more than sin, more than uprising, more than contagion. The unknowable. Years later, the official record would state, the enslaved girl known as Eden was never recovered following the structural failure of Old St. Matthew's Episcopal Chapel. The cause of collapse remains inconclusive. But that was not the whole truth. For months following the incident, people across Charleston continued reporting strange occurrences, shadows that moved against the wind, voices humming beneath church floorboards, children waking with gray dust on their feet. The Perrin household swore Eden's silhouette lingered at their window long after her disappearance. And Clara Beaumont, grown pale and solemn beyond her years, continued sketching circles, those same impossible interlocking symbols, until her mother finally burned the drawings in the hearth. Jonah knew better than anyone that the presence had not departed. "You can't shut a door once it opened both ways," he told Archer before being forced back to Edisto. "Not without paying the cost." Archer did not disagree. In his later years, he kept a journal locked inside a brass chest. The final entry read, "The city believes she is gone. I do not. There are nights I feel the air shift, and I know Eden walks between worlds, and perhaps she always did." Charleston moved on. But it never forgot, and neither did the land beneath it. History prefers to bury its most unsettling truths, not with malice, but with exhaustion. Charleston eventually smoothed the edges of the Eden affair into something manageable, something domestic, something the city could speak of without trembling. The decades that followed were marked by war, reconstruction, epidemics, industry, but for those who lived through the summer of 1844, the memory never softened. They carried it like a thin, invisible scar. Even now, the scholars who study the fragments, Archer's journals, Clara's sketches, Jonah's whispered accounts, admit there is a shape around the story they cannot grasp, something incomplete, something still turning just beneath the surface of memory. Was Eden a child caught in the cross-currents of fear and superstition, a vessel for forces beyond comprehension, or simply a soul split by trauma, misunderstood in an era that feared what it could not name? You've walked with us through every shadowed corner of this tale. So what do you believe? Was this mystery unveiled, or quietly buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments. If you want more journeys into America's darkest forgotten histories, like this video and subscribe for next week's story.